up my shameless promo plug.
Acceptable.
Evolution Hour with the patreon.com that has fewer people there than for Jeranism and Flat Earth. So it's something onward and upward Excelsior. Okay, so the people can see the fact that I am a desperate, pathetic person in need of finances. That one off, and then we can stop our little sharing, bloop, 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 and get back over to the happy moment. Are in another wonderful world of Evolution Hour, and I thought it would be delightful about something not incendiary like. And hi, Jackson, you've finally landed in the dorm there, where I heard all sorts of sounds as you opened doors and so forth and so on.
It tends to happen. There's much smashing of things involved. Check the black box right under here. Savannah, check right under here. Yep. So let me actually
official showtime here.
Let me turn my camera off. There you go. There we go.
It's going to be something.
Yeah, I thought it would be a fun subject because a lot of people, the notion that somehow or other religion is going to wither away into nothingness if only we use science and reason. And I'm going, oh, no, no, no. Religion is far too deeply ingrained in our cognitive architecture for that. Now, individual religions come and go. That's for sure. But we know that from the history of humanity. No religion that's currently done today has been around for very long in the big scheme of things. When you got 200,000 years of our species, a couple thousand years, just an eye blink, damn it. But the idea that there would be cognitive architecture that makes patterns and tells stories and invents gods and the like, and that's kind of part of how we construct things in our head, that's supported by the cognitive literature a great deal, and it spills over once you realize that the brain systems that generate religion generate other stuff, maybe even intense sports team identification and politics and a few other things, and that they can start identifying what brain systems are actually involved. I put a blurb up annotation for the video to a couple papers by Kapogiannis et al. From 2009, one of them from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the other one from PLoS ONE on the neuroanatomy of religiosity and cognitive systems involved in that. That's preliminary work kind of in the air. And both of them are open access, so people can access those and follow up on the stuff and look to see what work has been continuing on there. And then I also put a paper up that I was reminded of that was actually in my bibliography, and then somebody poked at me. Oh, gosh, yes, that's quite right. On how a particular brain system could be interfered with in a certain brain tumor, and it produced hyperreligiosity. And that's that Carmona-Bayonas paper from just February 2017 from Neurocase. That also, I believe, is open access, so people can poke around in that. And those in were just teasers to reflect on the fact that inside of our little meat computer here, we've got a lot of different subsystems that up in ways that in individuals can produce a sense of religiosity and a belief in divine spirits and larger stuff. It can be induced to some extent artificially by magnetic fields and stimulation. Persinger does work in that field. And we know that religious ecstasy from hypermeditation pops up apparently using the brain system that gets turned on during sexual arousal. So there's a lot of interesting little components that can end up into here. And with those kind of forces in play, heck, who would think religion would go away? But the evolutionary aspect is, why do we do that? And is there maybe an evolutionary selection pressure for brains that can do that?
I would say yes.
Yeah, and I was performing, in effect, a thought experiment. I'll use as my theoretical example here Ricky Gervais's The Invention of Lying. And I was really impressed by that film because he made a connection that I didn't realize how beautiful it was until he noticed it as well. And I go, wow, of course. And that is, in this world in which nobody can lie, if you posit that telling a religious tale is a lie, that there's gods and all this stuff, it's not true. But you know what else this culture that can't lie can't do? They don't tell any fiction. There's no fiction. There are no stories. Everything is documentary. There are no novels. So if you look at Moby Dick or King Lear or any of those stories, those are made-up tales. Brain that can't produce religion, you also can't produce made-up stories of any kind. And if you think about what might have happened in a culture, why do we make up stories? We're the storytelling species. That's one of the two things that distinguish us from all other critters. We are the tool makers who tell stories. Now, there may be storytellers, but they can't make tools. That may be the cetaceans. We don't know what stories humpback whales can tell. We can't translate them. It maybe sounds like maybe they tell stories to each other. Who knows? And a lot of our primates and birds and others can actually make interesting tools, but they can't tell stories because they don't have a language that can construct that. We can put the two together. And so we have instrumentalities and we have ability to construct stories about stuff. Now, some of the stories are practical. They explain why we think things are the way they are. Why is there rain? Yeah, jump in.
Savannah says she loves that movie, the Ricky Gervais movie.
Yeah, it was way more profound than it had any right to be if it were just a light comedy. And for me, it was touching and poignant and touched on deep psychological concepts. The idea that there's a reason why we like to tell these stories. And the other half of just the practical story of why is there rain and why is that big light in the sky and why is it so bright and why I shouldn't look at it.
Unless you're Donald Trump.
Unless you're Donald Trump, yes. Yeah, don't look at that. Oh, I'm going to look at it. We'll find out. As a complete aside,
all of a
if
sudden.
you looked at it long enough, and it only takes a fraction of a second to burn the retinas, and it might not, it can take days before it starts showing up with bad vision. And it's
Hashtag Our Lady of Fatima.
Yeah. The thing is that this might force them to have a full, proper medical examination of the president. And who knows where that might lead. Anyway, back to Ricky Gervais and storytelling. The other kind of storytelling we do is the stories of things we want to be true, or the stories we tell as a way to help us understand things about life. So many people can have a greater impact and understanding of stuff by seeing a fictional representation of it that's not true because it's a made-up tale. It's a heightened reality. It's a more perceptive reality because it tells us the things that we need to look at in the way we want to look at them in terms of the characters and all that, which is why Shakespeare still operates and why serious stories still carry weight, even though the people who wrote them have been long ago. So we make up these stories. We do it at the drop of a hat. We do it through language, which suggests that enormous amount of what makes us what we are has to do with the fact that we have a grammatical language that can tell stories in this way, and we're still poking around as to how that goes on in the brain. But I'm pondering as a hypothetical, imagine a hominid species that literally cannot tell stories. They're just purely experiential, they're very practical, they look at what they can see, they don't speculate, they may or may not have a rudimentary language, and that's another question. Can you have language without ending up telling stories? We don't know yet enough about the cognitive architecture of the brain to really, but theoretically in future the scientists can work out more and more about how our brain systems function and what connects up to what. We now know, for example, that neurasthenia, where you perceive colors when you see words and things like that, have to do with the fact that the brain centers that produce those two signals are really close together, and they can have crosstalk and wiring that connects up, and so it's a little short circuit zip, and that's why certain people can do that and others can't. And so that the mechanisms of storytelling that we do and language construction may in fact be so inextricably linked that it's suddenly like a state change. Once you start doing the one, you automatically start doing the other. And that's why you would have a kind of a more abrupt transition from one to the other, as suddenly, boom, you got it and you're doing it. It would be neat if we could put people from ancient hominids under the MRI to find out what's going on in their heads. So it all has to be done inferentially. We do know by direct brain endocasts that Homo habilis had Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are systems that are used in language. And they aren't dedicated to language, they do other stuff. But the thing is they are part of our language processing system now. So how much of the language systems, that brings up the little phrase that I dropped off as a teaser in the description of the video. And Jackson, you've heard, I think, me use this definition before, that religion, in my view, is a neotenous spandrel that is sustained as a scorched earth defense. And that was the thing I toss out, and I don't mean it flippantly. The idea that religion is coming from neuroarchitecture that is at the root of how we construct reality when we're a kid. We interpret things as to functionality and purposefulness and intentionality. We do it at the drop of a hat, and eventually we kind of trim away things where we decide that the leaf isn't scared as it falls and the moon isn't actually looking at us and following us at night and all of that. But there's very little in our experience that can weed away supernaturalist thinking because it's not part of our regular environment. So those things can stay on, like, use the word cobweb, but in some respects a useful cobweb that can still occur. You can also look demographically at whether or not brains that can easily accept religious explanations for things get along better socially, perhaps. They may be more cohesive. They can do things collectively maybe more. And that's where we get into the other aspect, the scorched earth defense. That something which has a downside can be sustained genetically because the thing that it does isn't as bad as the thing it protects you from. And so if you think about minds that can't do religion at all, their species go extinct. The minds that maybe might do too much of it end up devouring themselves as cultures. The ones that hit, I can't say a happy medium, but kind of a dynamic range, go through panic modes every once in a while and can be troublesome, but overall their cultures sustain over time. Argument that religion has an upside and a downside. Now, what we've done ironically in the West over the last couple hundred years is insulate culture from the bad side of religion and not from the good. So you end up with systems where you can't squirrel on your neighbor and say that they're a witch and have the cops come and arrest them and burn them at stake. You can still have
unless you're in Kansas.
Unless you're in certain cultures where you can still do those sorts of things. And so the positive aspects of religion is cohesion. We know, I can just observe it, that religious convictions can produce great art, can produce great music. Anybody who likes Bach is listening to somebody worshiping God, right? Every single note. Coffee cantata, it's still Bach worshiping God. And so we know that it can produce enormous inspiration. Things don't have to be true to do that. I have a fabulous collection of playing cards, including a bunch of occult tarots that were done during the big occult boom. And a lot of them are just extraordinary works of art, but it's complete flapdoodle. It's nonsense. It's all made up mythology, the tarot as an occult device. But you got some pretty pictures done by it because people believe it to be true. They accept the story. They like the story. It says something they want to be true, and they act on it, and it changes their behavior. That prospect there, Jackson.
On what in particular? I think there's a lot.
Any reaction, yes. Pick a thing, anything where you go, or something you go, hey, that's kind of interesting. Whatever, just a reaction, because can't be all me all the time.
Well, I don't know. We like hearing you talk. Yeah, I don't know. It's very interesting to talk about the changing moral zeitgeist in relation to what religion says. I think that was something you mentioned with we can't burn, you know, we can't call someone a witch anymore and have them burned at the stake. We could in 1500, but we can't anymore.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is not it's we can do that through the process of rational reasoning to get to we've used rational reasoning to get to a place where we can't do that anymore. And so I think that is objectively better than a place where we could do that.
Secularism is important, but you know, there's been the logical positivists in the 1920s are probably the neatest example here, and for that matter, the French Revolution and the Soviet Union. French Revolution in the early 1800s, and late 1700s, early 1800s, and then the Russian Revolution during the 1920s. Both of them had what now seemed to be a hopelessly naive idea that they would be able to eradicate religion through their reforms and social constructs. The Soviet Union in particular thought that people were, jump in.
Oh, well, I mean, I can understand from the French people's perspectives, because you've got a lot of peasants, a lot of poor people, and and you've got this huge church system that is just bearing down on all of them. And so they finally get the chance to throw off the shackles, and of course they're going to do it. You know, they had the I can't remember any of the treaties now. I used to know them for like world history, but but I just remember there was like they passed, you know, law after law or act after act saying, all right, we're going to take this power away from the church now. Okay, now we're going to take this power away from the church now. And so,
the French Revolution and the same thing with the Russian Revolution were both things where there were extremely oppressive systems. They were grinding poverty. Church wasn't taxed at all, and neither were aristocrats. For all practical purposes, the only people that paid taxes were the middle class and working class. Everybody else was on the public tit, including churches. So you had these enormously privileged and wealthy people who had clerical collars or had titles. And boy, that was a recipe for disaster. But beyond that was the whole notion, once the revolution took place, of course, you had this battle between the old guard, or Enlightenment minds, who nonetheless didn't like the extreme, let's remake everything in society bit. And again, it split the friendship between Jefferson and Adams over that very issue. But the Russians replayed this same thing in the 20th century, even more brutally than the French Revolution did. But they had the idea that the people were effectively blank slates. And if you raise them in a non-religious environment, exactly, that there will be no religion. The only reason why the religion is there is because they're enculturated with it. Well, we know from our neurobiology now that that's bullpucky. That's nonsense. That there are all sorts of mechanisms that happen in the brain and how we construct our realities that are drawn to that naturally, and some people will have much more propensity towards this. They will have a religious impression of their interactions with nature quite naturally. Now, the doctrinal veneer on that, which God, you know, are you all oogly boogly over Quetzalcoatl or Marduk or the God of Abraham or whichever, depends on largely the culture you're from and the social dynamic of what's going on. That people who are feeling angered by the religion will tend to react against it, but they may not give up. You can argue that Stalinism was an extremely oppressive religious system without a god.
It's the biogeography of religion.
Yeah, and so those are all fascinating socioeconomic and cultural frames, that there's an inertia to a religion. Once it becomes very, very dominant, you can step back. And Daniel Dennett's book, although I have quibbles with him on a lot of things, nonetheless, he's very perceptive still. And his book on the evolution of religion is really Unweaving the Rainbow or some such thing. I can't remember the exact title of it. It was fairly recent. It's still useful because the big picture that I took away from it is that religions start out relationships to figure out, you know, there's rain, we need rain, what do we do to get on the rain god's side, who is the rain god, and all of that. And then only later on do the kinds of higher level philosophical religions that say what is the good and what is moral and not, your kind of philosophical Platonic style gods. That takes a while to develop and will develop in effect independently in various cultures. And the ones that tend to survive are ones that
Oh,
over time.
I think I might have found it from bacteria to Bach and back, the evolution of minds. That's one. It says February 2017. Oh, are you talking about breaking the cell? Religion as a natural phenomenon?
The recent book he wrote, I think he was called that, or some other, and it was a quite perceptive and interesting book. That you eventually have a highly, well, basically what people do is over time as a culture, they reform God to be the thing they want to have as a God that meets their needs. And we tend to have a thing we like, that there's a general trend in religions to think that gods are nice, that they have our interests at heart, that they're buddies and friendly. They may have a petulant side a little bit, but they tend not to be vindictive. The old Greek gods were very human. They were petulant. They could be ferocious. We don't tend to have gods like that anymore. We find it uncomfortable to have gods like that. We want gods that that are the best of our nature. They're the ideal of what we want to be, and we give them those attributes. And then we command the god to tell us to do the thing we ought to do anyway. So it's a fascinating feedback loop that you get into. But the veneer, the name the god has, is an arbitrary accident of history. You got little over half of the world technically believes in God of Abraham. But the versions between Islam and Christianity, and even Roman Catholic Christianity versus Greek Orthodox versus Protestant, is pretty varied. Technically speaking, you could get up above the 50% level if you lump them all together as God of Abraham. That was an accident of history, that you add Christianity becoming an imperial religion where one of the most dominant powers of its region made it everybody's religion, whether you liked it or not, and it spread around, and eventually you had the ideas filtering into Islam, where they then spread it in their empire. And then the Europeans that colonized the world took it around and said, okay, you natives, you're going to become Christians now. And that way that spread all around.
Whether or not benighted cultures.
Whether or not it would have happened that way, and whether Christianity or Islam or any others, if they hadn't have used those means, would have just spread purely by the conviction aspect is another matter. And they might have been a series of more regional religions that would have persistent cultural traits in the way that Hinduism is largely a phenomenon of India. You have some living outside, but largely from immigrants who carry it with them. But it doesn't spread a heck of a lot. About the only bootstraps ecumenical religion are Buddhists, who wander around and basically kind of convert one thing at a time. And a large proportion of Buddhists don't live in countries that are dominated by Buddhists. Although if they do live in a country dominated by Buddhists, and as in Burma and others, they can be just as annoying as Christians can in terms of persecuting minorities. So that shows that there's common traits to things. But anyway, the upshot is my suspicion that generate religion the way the liver secretes bile. That it's just can't avoid it. Although the content of it will go through complex contingencies. And we don't worship bulls that we put their antlers up on walls the way they did at Catalhulic 11,000 years ago. We do something else. We don't necessarily do religions where we run around stone circles and worship the arrival of the sun and departures on the equinoxes, the way they did in Britain. We don't necessarily worship ejaculation as a symbol for fecundity, the way the Egyptians would do it, or to some extent
Onan either.
Yeah, and so you've got all these little trends that relate to the gradual upgrading of the religions to a much more philosophical, Aristotelian, Platonic, upper level God, and even the other idea of division of labor. It's kind of interesting that you've got a zillion different gods in Hinduism. You still have a trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva that are kind of like the top echelon doers of things, and everybody else is kind of miscellaneous intercessories, which is a weird parallel to the trinity in Christianity, where a unitary God gets converted into a God that has multiple natures simultaneously, and then there are saints underneath those that you have as intercessories. Islam as kind of a Unitarian Protestant format, but then developed in effect a reverse formation where the Shiites developed ones with had intercessory imams and saints and all of that. So there seems to be kind of general trends to what large-scale religions have a tendency to do that meets the social needs of the human little meat computers that render it component. So if it's the case that to create religions of some sort, natural phenomenon, in the same way you're going to have sports identification, and we're going to make music and theater, and we're going to tell stories, maybe the most you can hope for and the most desirable to hope for is to promote social systems that, like the Enlightenment, put curbs on the excesses, the downsides of the religion. Don't attempt to stamp it out, because that's a waste of time. It's never going to happen. But keep them from hijacking the power of the state to enforce orthodoxy. And that, I contend, is a more doable thing than the idea in some big super sciencey sense that we're going to educate religion out of everybody. Forget that.
Yeah, there is no getting or educating it out of everyone. We certainly can, especially with things like cognitive dissonance is something we talk about a lot with the community, especially with the more fundamentalist guys. They just and as you point out, they don't think about what they don't want to think about. And if they do think about it, on the other hand, then they can just rationalize it or reject it altogether. So
Michael Shermer has been kind of useful here because he asks the more general question, and he was building on Bruce Hood, which I'd mentioned before, Super Sense, which I recommend everybody read. It's a really important, relatively small book, but it's still very, very illuminating. But Shermer is built off of that, is to ask the general question. Instead of simply asking, why do people believe things that aren't true, as opposed to things that are true? Things. And that's the deeper issue of how we're a brain that likes to believe things. So I think one of his books was called The Believing Brain. And it's not something that you can get away from, because in my other annoying little lecture on non-overlapping magisterium that I came up with, the NOMA D, if you're dealing with ethics, oughts, and shoulds, you can't avoid jumping into belief, because it's driven entirely by belief. It's totally by assumption. There is no sciencey way to tell you whether or not killing is good or bad, or blowing up a planet is a good or a bad thing. You have to use ethics and reasoned morality to be grounded in presumptions that you have to consciously work through. That's why it's philosophy. And some of them can be drawn from religious context. Some of them can be drawn from non-religious context. You don't need gods to do this. In fact, it could be argued that that's probably a dangerous thing, to be relying on stories that people have made up about the gods to act as a guide here. But still, you're going to have to make up a story. You're going to have to decide what you believe to be true, and then you act upon it, and it changes your behavior in measurable ways or not. And theoretically, some societies could be better measured. Jump in.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to wait until you were finished. I think I say to Robert Richardson here that I think the internet has done irreparable damage to religion. You just look at the polls, at every poll regarding non-religiosity or irreligiosity, they are consistently on the rise in like practically every demographic. They're just up and up and up.
Certainly among millennials, although don't count your super secularist chickens before they're hatched. What a lot of the measurements show is a lack of faith in or agreement with organized traditional religions. But we don't know yet exactly whether or not the whole mental demographic of ability to believe things that aren't true, the Tortucan bell curve, whether or not that's changed dramatically or not. Now, what the internet has done, a cornucopia of information flow. And so the same internet that allows people in countries around the world to read a Richard Dawkins piece where they wouldn't have heard about it before, also allows them to look at an Alex Jones video as they would never have done before. So it accelerates the ability to take whatever it is your cognitive architecture was doing and accelerate its ability to process whatever information you feel like doing. And so there, I would argue that people who have a Tortucan kind of mind will map on to the things that they have as objects of desire, more than not. And it may be things that are true. One of the interesting shoes that drops in the Tortucan model, that this doesn't tell you about whether or not what you believe is true or false or not. That you can have a Tortucan mind, somebody who's over-reliant on secondary sources and who doesn't fact-check and things like that, but yet you've mapped onto things that are true. And you're just as sloppy a thinker as flat earth Jaredism, but people don't notice it because you've mapped onto things that are true. So in some respects, we've kind of overlooked the inherent weirdness that can occur in human beings. I don't know empirically that the mix of people who are prone to believe things that are cockamamie wrong is any more or less than it was 100 years ago. It just is we can measure it now. We can observe its behavior a lot better now, in the same way that right-wing extremism, which would have been in the, oh, Sam the scientist joined this call. Hello, glad you were able to make it. I didn't know whether or not the signal was going to get through.
No, well, I just got out of a meeting with, just a short meeting with my boss, so we just wanted to talk over some results. So that was, I was actually
okay.
just came from science. Sorry, what's up?
How long can you stay, Sam?
Probably about 20 to 30 minutes.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's excellent there. I'll just give you a micro recap of what we've been talking here before I poke at you for what I invited you in to discuss, which was Rana. But I was discussing with Jackson and getting some feedback from our audience about the idea that my contention that religion is a very natural thing for brains to do, although individual religion is a cultural phenomenon that gets inherited. And the odds are that our meat computer really ain't going to give it up anytime soon. And we have to kind of adapt our cultures and secular protections to keep the downsides from not swamping us, and the religious stuff will go on anyway. That's the upshot of it. What with you in Rana this morning was where you were talking about your analysis of one of his papers. I think it was in relation to the human chromosome fusion, was it? Or was it from a different thing?
I think it was where he's argued in various places that there's that chromosomal atom, or Y chromosomal atom and mitochondrial Eve were literal people who were the Adam and Eve corresponding to the Bible. And
nice.
And what the problem is that this doesn't seem likely. The best evidence seems to suggest. Sorry, it's probably a lag on my part because I'm on my cell phone. But the best evidence that I've read, and luckily, I took an entire course on computational phylogenetics. Not computational phylogenetics, population genetics algorithms as an elective a year ago, and the best data suggests that it's really unlikely that they were alive at the same time, and it's really unlikely.
Yeah, they conducted a very long-term pen pal relationship from about 40,000 years apart.
Yeah, I mean, granted, this is getting to the point where, these algorithms tend to not be as precise as we would want them to be, right? So it's not as if, you could sequence my genome and infer, a bit about maybe where my family has been in some sense, but the amount of precision, right? If I'm Eastern European Jewish, so you would find, a lot of Polish in there, but let's say that my Polish ancestors decided to move to France for a bit to work as migrant workers, and then they just moved back to Poland. Well, I would never know that my ancestors could have been in France for 3 generations. So the amount of precision that we have with these measurements, it's a fair criticism to say they're not horrifically precise, but I don't think it's fair to say that because a lot of his objections are with a ton of these techniques is they're not sufficiently precise to trust evolution writ large, which I think is a huge logical leap that's not justified.
Absolutely. That is, yeah, that's you. Even if we can't, precisely date these, like Y chromosomal atom, was he lived like, it was like 40,000 years ago? Was that Y chromosome atom?
I want to say it's closer to 100,000 years ago.
Yeah, and I think the mitochondrial Eve was, I think, the oldest. I seem to think that was like 140,000 or something like that.
So I want to say that you're correct. It's not my specific area.
And then
I accept your data is probably more correct than mine. But I was just the point that even it's like, well, we know whenever anything is dated, there's going to be a margin of error. But that margin of error is getting, over time, progressively smaller. And I think that is the important part to remember about these dating methods. Yeah, the Earth was thought to be maybe 100 million years ago or so, 100 years ago. But the margin of error has decreased so significantly that speaks for itself, I think.
Yeah, that was why I was so fascinated by the paper that you alluded to, and I was curious to know if you remembered which paper it was, and that I can then track down Rana's utilization of it, because of the idea that he had relied on or downplayed the paper because it suited what he wanted to be true. Am I summarizing it?
Yes. So I'll explain the entire context, and I will try to. I did follow you on G+ on one of my accounts, so I will tag you in it when I find it again. But I was reading about it, and they were saying like, oh, well, the population must have been, tens of thousands. But, what they don't account for is that in the past, they've significantly underestimated the amount of heterozygosity in isolated populations. Now, I don't remember the exact species, so you'll have to forgive me. But I read the paper. Mm-hmm. And basically, when they had plugged in a parameter for what is typically in these equations known as theta, right? Which is typically angle, but it's usually used as a population-scaled heterozygosity, which is basically just the number, for those that don't know, heterozygosity is basically genetic diversity. In this context, it's a loose proxy. And so what they found is on this island population that their current models underestimated the heterozygosity in this small isolated island population by 4 times, which is incredible. That's a really cool finding. I just got into my car if you just heard that. But
bing, bing.
The interesting thing, it's making sure that it's I'm not going to die on this drive. But
warning, fasten seatbelt. Warning.
Yeah. The interesting thing about the way that Rana uses, he goes, oh, look, see, current models underestimate population heterozygosity in recent bottlenecks, which, I mean, I don't know how he gets around that was a caveat in the paper, but that suddenly this means that, there could have been 2 individuals. Now, for those of us who are savvy with math, when you're talking about tens of thousands of people, you're talking about 4 orders of magnitude versus 4, which is less than 1 order of magnitude. That is a huge difference. And to make the extrapolation that he makes, I would argue, is, without running, and by the way, maybe he runs his own simulation and he says, look, this is within the margin of error given this paper.
Ooh, I suspect he doesn't.
Oh, no, nothing. Just, look, see, they're constantly underestimating heterozygosity. And you just have to say, like, Rana should know better. And that's the biggest thing is, it's not as if I'm some savant at population genetics. I've taken, I happen to have taken a course on it, but, by no means is that my area of expertise. And it's one of those things where, you kind of find these, he's not a guy, I will give him credit. He doesn't make outright scientific errors, but in my, in my opinion, what he does, he kind of leaves out context and doesn't do the rigorous thing that he
Yeah.
would need to do? I don't know if I'm being clear. I'm a little scatterbrained right now.
I put a link up there, a reference to a tip 1.3 at my website, which was on punctuated equilibrium. And Marana showed up in that because he is only one of two people in the entire anti-evolution movement who ever tried to relate punctuated equilibrium concept to actual data, make an anti-evolution point about it. And he managed to get all four of the papers he discussed wrong. He just didn't seem to understand their content. It was just terrible. And so, yeah, the idea that he would be riffing off of a little fragment, a little bone that he can pick up, and it looks good, and then he twists it around so that it fits their very vague model. That's something that Rana does. It's something Ross does. It's a fascinating fog bank that goes on in Reasons to Believe. But of course, we have to remember that the old Earth creationism is a relatively minor niche. It's really all young Earth creationists or the vague intelligent design branch. And so this fence straddling thing that RTB tries to do is a tough game to pull off.
Well, you do wonder, right? You know, I mean, the first thing that I want to give Fuzz credit for is he's a PhD in biochemistry. Now, I can tell you as someone who is currently doing a PhD right now, which I am, is that even I have a very interdisciplinary field, but I don't have the deepest knowledge of everything in my field. It's just impossible, right? Mm-hmm. So likelinesses, and granted, biological sciences are going through a revolution right now, but likeliness is he knows one area, one sub area of biochemistry, and
yeah,
paleontology is so far afield of anything molecular in biology, and I tend to stick to the molecular, that I don't even I instantly have to say, well, I would check with this, or I read this in this book, but I have no concept of what the literature is in paleontology, and I'd be lying if I was, you know. So if I said
that's what I have fun with, because I am knee deep in the whole technical literature issue, because that's the game that I'm doing in the source methods approach. It's revealing that Rana is a biochemist. Dwayne Gish, the young Earth creationist, was a biochemist. Michael Behe is a biochemist over at Intelligent Design Land. Michael Denton, one of their big stars, is a biochemist. It's a field that sort of bumps into biology, but yet it's kind of farther removed. It's much more the chemistry rather than the bio part. And it's an area that makes them feel that they have an expertise because they have the little narrow tunnel vision thing. But when you start looking at the sources and seeing what they deal with, I keep on poking Rana to see whether or not I can ever probe him on the reptile-mammal transition, because nobody at Reasons to Believe has ever written a damn word on the reptile-mammal transition. It's just a non-subject for them. So, you know, when he talks about the fossil record in macroevolution, I'm going, therapsids, damn it! But he literally doesn't think about it, and none of them ever bothered to do it.
Well, the thing I'll give him credit for is I think that he's a very clear writer, actually, when I read his blog. And that's something that I have to say is sorely missed among the creationist crowd. Is you find people who want to be convoluted for the sake of being convoluted. This was apparent, you know, if you've ever dealt with Nephilim Free, for instance. You know, they just use fancy terms.
Those you're dealing with the, yes, I have, unfortunately.
There you're dealing with the Wackaloon branch, yes. The ones that if they don't spell with a lot of capitals, they ought to. Yeah, that's a completely different thing. Yeah, the literacy that goes on, frankly, the literacy that goes on in young Earth creationism, if you read the average technical paper at Answers in Genesis's research journal, they're very lucid and careful and coherent. But where they all fall apart, this level, that's the Achilles heel, because they can't play fair with their sources. They've got to be data select. They use outdated material. They go for authority quotes. They'll parse for just the little teeny snippet, and it's an undoing the moment you start paying attention to the source days. I make it a point of following up on everything. That's why when I get the source material from you on the Rana case, I will track down how he used it, and I will track down the original paper, and I will track down how it's been used in the larger context. I think I got like I'm just past 22,000 technical papers in my data set at the moment. So I've got a sweep that's way bigger than anybody else in this area.
Yeah, it's certainly. I always feel like I have too much literature on hand, and now I feel sorely embarrassed then, because I'm constantly
Nobody had ever
reading.
measured it before. Nobody had ever measured this before. National Center for Science Education does a little bit of the antiquarian approach, but they don't quantify it. And it was only when I was getting down to the point where I realized, my gosh, I've got 50,000 sources in my bibliography and a spreadsheet where I can count up stuff. I go, wait a minute, measure what they've cited. And so I started setting up subroutines that would look at all of that stuff. So at the moment, I've pinned down that there's a little over 3,000 technical papers that have been cited in the anti-evolution literature.
What's interesting is, and I wonder if you could somehow do a test on what's the impact of those papers, because I often encounter when I deal with creationists is that if they're talking about a paper that is in a prominent journal, they have almost always got the claim completely wrong, because prominent journals, if you read Nature, as I'm sure you're aware, or Cell, or now Science, on almost every article they have a summary page before, if you download the PDF, you read the actual article, where you have to be just pig ignorant to not get the point, from at least the gist. I'm not going to say that you're going to get a deep insight from reading an abstract, but do you ever find that really they stick to more obscure journals than not?
Oh, no, actually, part of it's the squeaky wheel syndrome. That technical work that gets publicized in the popular media tends to be noticed way more. So, oh, they just did a report on the new whale fossil. Whoop, they home in on that one. Ooh, IDA, the new human evolution question of that. Whoop, they home in on that. So most of the technical citations that get addressed in anti-evolutionism relate to the stars that get on the evening news, and there's a huge amount of secondary citation first. They may end up citing the technical paper at some point, but not necessarily. Now, where you get the more obscure journals will come along when you deal with the detail fiddlers. That's an extremely small thing. I'll tell you that you've got, to put numbers to it, I track about 2,000 people in evolutionism. That's generated a little over 8,000 sources. Of those 2,000 people, 95% of them never cite a primary source at all, period. When you finally narrow it down to a core group of only about 90 people who generate about 2/3 of all the anti-evolution citations, and everybody else kind of copies them. But nested in them is a ridiculously small group of only about 50 people who are the fact claimants. And Fazal Rana would be in that category, Andrew Snelling over in Creation Science, Michael Denton, Behe, and all of that. But those are the ones that are actually making the primary source claims. There's no direct indication that they either home in on prominent sources or irrelevant ones. They're basically approaching science apologetically. Can they find something that says what they need for the purpose of the article, for the argument that they're making? And Michael Denton is an excellent example of that, because I just all of his material for doing slam dunk, so I tracked down all the technical citations that he did. And some of the stuff from more obscure journals is old material that he probably glommed onto when he was just learning his biochemistry stuff back in the 70s. And then there's a big hole that you suddenly start seeing him cite more recent material, and it can be all over the map because they have access to the internet in a way they did before. So overall, I'd say no, they don't have a tendency to focus on either big journals or small journals. What they are doing is going after things that are squeaky wheel important that get into the media, or things that meet their own particular hobby horses that they're obsessed with. Human evolution, the chromosome shift. Jeffrey Tompkins, the geneticist who is a young Earth creationist, I think he's at the University of Georgia, he has a bone to pick on that kind of stuff. And so they'll home tunnel vision in on their obsessions. Rana is not that much of a primary source guy, riffing off of other material. And so he does some things that he's interested in, but a lot of it is citing some of the other people in the field. And I haven't measured everything with Rana, but I know that when he plays it on his own, like he did with punctuated equilibrium, boy, he's out of his depth.
Well, you wonder, and you bring up the point that it's a lot of biochemists. It's a lot of biochemists. It's a lot of computer scientists.
Yeah, physicists to some extent, computer engineers. Dembski comes from the information and mathematics background. Virtually no, you get a few, virtually no paleontologists. Beckley, who is now their kind of pet paleontologist over in intelligent design land, he's an insect paleontologist, a minor but not undistinguished career, and I don't know yet what the hell version of intelligent design he has because he hasn't actually ventured in on it. But the fact that for all practical purposes paleontology is done only by evolutionists is telling you something. It's the sweat equity thing. This is not a field that helps anti-evolutionism.
Well, I mean, the funniest thing to me, and this has happened to me several times, and I bet if you're knee deep in paleontology, you might have actually heard of the person who wrote me one of my grad school recommendations. And no, she didn't. No, she wrote me a study abroad recommendation. Never mind. Who taught me evolutionary biology. I've actually had her cited against evolution to me. Just hilarious. The woman that taught me evolutionary biology as an undergrad, right? So I've had that. I've had people cite people who interviewed me for grad school. You know, people who I listed their research as interesting, and their work gets cited in these debates. So it's always very funny when one of the revelations now is that I've had people now cite people that I know personally. And I go, if I introduced you to this person, I assure you they would not be pleased. Which
You know,
I always
there's
find
that
very
parasitism.
funny.
There is the parasitism aspect, because if you have a mind that can easily read or hear something and then decide it's true and never do any follow-up on it, you can easily come to think that there's a controversy about punctuated equilibrium, for example, or issues that were cutting-edge stuff 70 years ago that, you know, we move on, thank you. And because they don't read the primary material, they don't realize, yeah, they've been getting a skewed version of it. Rana at least has the fence that he tries to read the original material, but there's only so far down he's willing to go. And when you manage to miss the primary data, when you cite papers on punctuated equilibrium that aren't on punctuated equilibrium and don't seem to realize that, that's giving you a sense of the kind of fog bank blind spot in people's heads, even in the higher level that you get into with Rana. That's separate all from temperament. If you're dealing with somebody like a Kent Hovind that are secondary redactors, these are people who are filtering material, usually stuff a long time ago, and they can't quite wean themselves off of it. Even Andrew Snelling is like that with some of his own material. He gets things that he views as hobby horses, and then he never does any follow-up on it. So from a methods direction, this is just a fascinating window. People put together arguments, how they talk themselves into believing things that aren't justified by their sources. And it all starts unraveling the moment you start probing the primary source material, just as I'm sure you discovered when you looked up the paper to read, to check the math, to find out whether or not it said what Rana thought it did.
Or RJ, like when we looked up the Ken Hovin's, or not Ken Hovind, Ken Ham's claim about dinosaur size, and one of his sources was The Lost World by Michael Crichton.
Yes, Michael Crichton's novel, The Lost World. It wasn't even a technical thing. And that one just got cycled through. Now, recently, a couple of creationists have tried to put new numbers to the case and tried to do an analysis, I guess probably because they don't dare try to suggest that Ken Ham was wrong. So they're kind of retrofitting the data there. But boy,
Yeah,
it's hilarious. From what I understand, the average size of a dinosaur is about the size of a car.
Yeah, yeah, I've been reading some papers about it, and the way the papers put it, at least from what I've seen, is not, they don't look at the average dinosaur size ever. They're looking at the average dinosaur size from period to period, which they say trends towards being larger.
And do you count it by species? Do you count it by genera? Do you count it by family?
Right,
You know,
right.
what measurement do you do? Do you count it by the number of specimens that there are around? So if you've got a zillion of a relatively small dinosaur, does that change the average when you have a relatively smaller population for the ones that are the size of a house? What do you do?
Well, it's an interesting thing, you know. I recall earlier towards this morning when I was just listening into the conversation. I recall, for example, you know, Fuzz was talking about he was talking about the Cambrian explosion, and I wanted to note, because one of the things you learn, and you do learn this in evolutionary biology at an undergraduate level, which, I mean, again, it's not a high level, is that one of the big innovations then at that time was body plans that could more easily fossilize. So that's part of the reason that there's a sudden appearance. And of course, Nestlig ended up saying that. But it's always interesting to me how foundational material just gets lost on a lot of the apologetic efforts, because I think people tend to be impatient with the foundations, which you just can't be. You know, the basic questions that you're asking of, well, how do we actually consider average size? Is that actually meaningful? What does that mean in the context of a species? You know, where's the time point on that? These are all relevant
I put
questions.
a question into Rana earlier that unfortunately didn't get asked, but I would have liked to have asked him, do you believe that anything alive today is physically descended from anything in the Cambrian? Because if not, then who the hell cares how many animal phyla there were during the Cambrian? It doesn't tell you a damn thing. You need to deal with why we have the diversity that we have now. Eventually I've got to do a whole analysis. For the tip chapter, I would be calling it the Cambrian burp, which is kind of delving into all of the paleontology of what was going on beforehand. And I would suspect it would have been nice to have had a back and forth conversation more with Rhonda to find out just what his map of time is on the Cambrian. I'm sure he is aware of the fact that the critters there are very unusual compared to what we're used to now. But whether or not he's really dived into the implications of what basal chordates were looking like, the fact that mollusks predate the big explosion part, the fact that we've got a whole hidden, at least he used the word Lagerstätten. Boy, that's actually kind of green eye shade stuff, the fact that he used that term. But that's opening up a can of worms, because Lagerstätten for the earlier periods of the Cambrian, or for the Precambrian. You have to go all the way back to Duchanteau, which is a Chinese thing that has phosphatization, which can only preserve stuff up to about 0.5 millimeter. So it's basically little itty bitty embryos. And if there had been a few more cell cleavages, they could have told whether they're proto-arthropods or something else. But yeah, luck of the draw. But you still got predation examples of where something is burrowing into something else. What that is, because there are no Lagerstätten deposits that preserve soft parts. So there's huge ecosystems that are complex organisms that are doing stuff for millions and millions and millions, 20 million years before you hit the big Cambrian explosion part, that we don't know exactly what's going on, but we know there's turnover and transition. Why the small shelly fauna take over during the Tomotian phase just before the big Cambrian explosion part. All of this is stuff that really evasive coverage in all the anti-evolution literature, whether it's Reasons to Believe or Young Earth Creationists or Intelligent Design stuff. It's like a fog bank of uncertainty in this area. And it's really important for us, our ducks in a row, and to be much more familiar with this stuff, because I think it's one of their Achilles heels. They're using it as a big apologetic brick to throw at evolution, and we can dislodge that one. That pulls a bit of the rug out from under their argument.
Well, I mean, I think it's very important. I think it's interesting to me, and I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, is that the way they use different areas of studies is very distinct. So what they'll do for something like developmental genetics, which I think has extraordinary evidence for evolution because of both the universality and the specialization of body plans. You know, the idea, I don't know how on a creation model you explain why you can insert a Drosophila, and they've done this, to insert a Drosophila Hox gene into a rabbit and have the rabbit develop properly. I don't know how that works on a creation model.
You get a certain amount of apologetic twists on the whole homeobox genes issue. Steve Meyer dances around the subject very gymnastically in Darwin's Doubt, and you get a lot of the material both in Young Earth creationism and at Reasons to Believe. But the larger issue of why things are structured the way they are, an evolutionary question is, since everything is related by natural branching common descent, the suspicion on an evolutionary ground would be that Ediacara biota, which are the strange stuff that was living about 50 million years before the big Cambrian explosion back in the Precambrian, that were the dominant ecosystem, strange palm frondy things and Dickinsonia that look like an ambulatory floor mat about the size of 3 feet long, and genes. Based on the phylogenies as you work backwards, something like that is likely to be the case on evolutionary grounds. And so from an evolutionary spectrum, they're starting to try to figure out how homeobox could be cis-regulatory modified and to produce the kind of very different architectural plans of the Ediacara biota. Whereas I don't know what would say on the subject. That's why it would have been fun to have pinned him down. Would he claim that Ediacara biota should have HOX genes at all from a design perspective? Would they need to have it? Did they need to be made of DNA? Do we have any evidence they were made of DNA at all? Couldn't they be on a completely different form of life? From a design perspective, why would you think one or the other? And they just don't think about these kinds of issues. Whereas evolution leads to actual activity. And one of the areas that I love banging over the heads of anti-evolutionists is paleogenomics, because it started out in the early 21st century when they started to take molecules like lactase molecules and that, where they would retro-engineer the ancestral form of it and test it out to find out that it had the intermediate functions they were predicting. This is by experiment. It's expanded more and more and more, where they've retro-engineered the bird beak back to the archosaur skull. They've retro-engineered the mammal teeth back 120 million years, including some that are in the reptile-mammal transition. Jackson, as he reads through my book, will spot all that material. That we're reaching a stage when they're retro-engineering stuff. That's all empirical science, and it's literally invisible. They just poke at it from the side, if at all. That's telling you something.
It's very interesting. I mean, I've actually never heard a creationist or an anti-evolutionist, let's take the broader category that you introduced, that actually addresses any of that. Yeah, I like that as well, because it's broader, because there's so many different flavors of these people. But that is interesting. I've never heard them mention it. And another thing is, I always sense that there's this intentional discomfort with engaging new material. Now, what was interesting is when Fuzz said he went to a conference on the origin of life, and he said, "Well, the science hasn't changed since 2002," and I wanted to say, "Well, there wasn't." And I just wanted to say, you can't just say to someone, I can't say you're being dishonest to your face, but you either went to a terrible conference or you're just lying to us, because I've personally, I subscribe to all the major journals. I get email blasts from all the major journals, and I have access because, I work at a university. So it's one of those things where I had literally sent someone else who was in the call, Dragnot Silvas. I send him articles that I find on the origin of certain structures like ribosomes, where they're doing they're doing kinetic modeling of what this thing would have looked like in all of its different stages. And you look at him and you go, this came out in the last year, So it's one of those things where you look at him and you just have to say, you're just lying. Like, he's a nice guy, but
I'm way more charitable. Robert Richardson has put a tag on. We'll have to get back to him. He has a question, but we're going on this one. One of the things that I'm doing in my TIP project that no one has done before, as I said, is measuring what's been cited and what hasn't. So I don't have to guess that anti-evolutionists are only bumping into 10% of the data stream. I'm measuring, and I can literally tell you source by source whether any anti-evolutionist has cited a technical paper or not. Some areas are almost completely invisible. Neuroscience, for example, is ignored by virtually everybody. Try finding a discussion of dinosaurs from a design perspective. That's another subject that's invisible. Reptile-mammal transition. Only 20 anti-evolutionists have even bumped into it since Dwayne Gish in the 1980s, and all of them screw up on it. So it's not at all unlikely. But Rana literally doesn't follow the technical literature close enough behind the data curve he is. The homeobox genes were only discovered in the 1990s. It was a huge revolution that came along. And since then, it has been an explosion of fields in this area. If you want to have an interesting introduction to where the literature is, and even now it's an 8-year-old article, but Eugene Koonen's piece in 2009 in Nucleic Acid Research. It's free, open access, anybody can get it. This is
he's
for
a
people
genius.
who want to know.
Just look up his
Fabulous.
look up his work on absolutely everything. You know, he's one of the guys that basically invented the concept of orthology, or really fleshed it out for the literature. And so he's considered the gold standard for a lot of those deep, using computer analysis on deep evolutionary things.
In my bibliography, everybody can download it. Don't try printing it out because the bibliography is 2,500 pages long, so it's not a good idea. But anyway, you can find Koonen in the K's, and the 2009 article, there's a whole bunch of them that he did in there because I have so much of Koonen, but it's from the Nucleic Acids Research thing. And it was a survey.
I actually have to take off, so thank you for having me.
Thank you for
hopefully
showing
we'll talk
up.
Again.
It was absolutely wonderful. Hope it didn't bore the tears off you.
No, it was absolutely enjoyable. But I will try to get on this some other time. So I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Sam. Au revoir, auf Wiedersehen. I'll just finish up. The point is that the anti-evolutionists will have a very, very narrow data set. And so Rana as a superficial, well, the Koonen piece is a perfect example, where Koonen did a fabulous survey of the systems that lead to multicellularity and all the deep genetic components. And a lot of it I already knew. And so I was checking against my bibliography to see what information I had and what I didn't. And it turned out that there were just huge candy store areas that I didn't have any knowledge about these systems because they were obscure things that were niche things. But Koonen, it's his field, so he was paying attention to it. So I was filtering all this. And then I realized as I was looking in my data set, nobody had ever cited that in the anti-evolution literature. Finally, to my surprise, at the Discovery Institute at one point actually came in and cited it, but not for its content. He was citing it for some trivial detail on mutation rate that wasn't anything to do with its actual content. And that was giving me a clue. How could you read that fabulous work and that's all you take from it? That's telling you a lot about the mindset. And I think Rana is in exactly that category. So Richardson, before you scroll completely off the screen, come in on what you were going to ask on your question. And now is the moment.
He was talking about Archaeoraptor, wasn't he?
If that was the case, yeah. I covered Archaeoraptor in 3 macroevolutionary episodes quite a bit, and I think in the other stuff. But if you go to my website and look at 3 macroevolutionary episodes, and I think it's up at I posted it at Academia EDU too, so it's free at a whole bunch of areas. And I went into quite a lot of that because it was an example of sloppy scholarship on the Archaeoraptor case, the Piltdown bird, as Jonathan Wells was fond of calling it, and how they'd seemed to miss the meat of it, which was half of the both of the fossils were real fossils. It was constructed as a chimera by fossil frauders because there's a market incentive in China as they moved to a market economy where they were going on filling every little local town with some fossil museum, and so there was a huge market to just come up with crap to fit in, and Archaeoraptor was one of those, and it got picked up by the late Stephen Serkis.
He said he wasn't asking about Archaeoraptor.
Oh, okay. Then which you were asking about Microraptor, and then jump in, Robert, and ask now.
Who was that asking about that earlier? Who was that then?
A bit of an argument lately about the pre-Ardipithecus finds in Bulgaria and Greece.
No, that wasn't him. That was Pheno.
Yeah.
That was Pheno. That's right. He was asking about Greekopithecus.
That popped up in the Rana argument. He was pushing that one up in the debate earlier. Greekopithecus is a new blip on the scope. it's a very basal primate that's farther back, that's more in the range of where you would be figuring out where chimpanzees and the branch that are leading off to the hominids we're more familiar with quite a long time later on. And so since this is in Europe, not in Africa, this opens up the prospect that there is a much greater diversity to what was going on than previous. I pointed out in the Rana thing, Steve tossed the mic to me for a few seconds so that I could fill him in on that. Chimpanzees have a terrible fossil record. The details on it, but the fact is they live in environments that disintegrate bones. So that's the, you know, they live in forest environments. It's just the worst possible place to get a fossil. And so there's very sparse data on the fossil record of chimpanzees. So figuring out when they diverge, we can look at the genes with living organisms, but to try to find the fossil trail and exactly which piece of real estate was involved in their diversification over a period of 5 or 10 million years, yeah, it's hard to find them. So this new blip on the scope puts a new blip on the scope. And we'll see how well the fossil genie does in finding more information on there. Paleogeographically, you'd have to work out what sea levels were in relation to distribution of animals. Remember, there was a desiccation of the Mediterranean Sea about 4 million years ago. And so there's a lot of stuff going back and forth on these things where animals can cross boundaries in one zone, but not in another.
I think that, well, based on the papers I've read about it, I think it's an Organopithecus, in which case is probably a member of Ponginae. At least that's from what I've seen. If
memory serves me on the Grecopithecus thing, I think it was like 7 million years ago or something like that. So it's far enough back for all the branchings that are occurring with our more hominid line down in Africa. And that's a thing that not a young Earth creationist. Rana is just as vague on chronology as creationists are, and intelligent designers the same way. They don't really put things in a map of time context. About the closest for those who watched the Rana thing earlier with Steve McCrae and Fowler debating it, there were a few dates bandied about, but not a lot. And it's often very difficult to figure out what they think is going on in terms of the chronological frame. I look at it, whenever you're looking at a fossil frame, you realize that there's a huge, vast network of time slices for which you only have little blips of information on. What's happening, it means that you only have the tiny little slice blip. And if you don't have that conception of what's going on or what the data that you're missing, but must have existed in order to get from blip A to blip B, the evolution model is really good at filling in the holes. And the more data blips you get, once in a while, you'll get a thing that goes off onto a siding. One of the reasons why Piltdown got looked at so scrupulously after World War II, when they finally got back to it, was that by 1945, Piltdown didn't fit in anymore. It looked really odd. It just didn't. Information that was coming from these Asian and African fossils about what human evolution was doing. And that's why they started looking at it closer again. It's no coincidence that Archaeoraptor was spotted by Storrs Olsen and the bunch at the Smithsonian who don't like the bird dinosaur theory. So they were really primed to look at the data stream very closely. You'll notice no creationists spotted it. No creationist ever spotted the problems with Piltdown either. It was always the evolutionists who would look at it more closely and that they would figure out in the course of events to work out the little details. Oh boy. Well, we're past the hour. That chewed things up in a hurry. I suppose we can also do a delightful after show to continue resuming on this, but I think I'm going to be calling this particular well over an hour to a halt. Any final comments, Jackson, about the show?
I really like Sam.
Yes, he was delightful. I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation that goes on because he's coming at it from what I would call a methods direction, just as you've come at things from a source methods direction. It involves tracking down the primary sources, but boy, you learn so much better that way, and you ground your argument so much more strongly when you approach it from a source methods direction, rather than just looking at it from philosophy or reading general accounts of what does Neil deGrasse Tyson say on the subject. I don't care what Neil deGrasse Tyson says on the subject. I'd rather read the science paper. Okay, we are about to shut down. Yes, after show, after show. I'll have to set up a new thing for that, and I will be sending tweeter messages on the location of it as soon as I get the thing set up. Okay. Auf Wiedersehen, aloha for, let's say it's 6:11. I should have it set up by 6:30. We'll be ready to fire off at 6:30, okay?